Good afternoon or morning to everyone, and welcome to our webinar. As I mentioned in the chat, please introduce yourselves, name, pronouns, and where you're joining us from, or an org you're representing. So I'm really excited for you to be here for our fourth installment of Abolition for Our People webinar. This webinar will focus on restorative justice practices, and I'm joined here today by two amazing advocates who work in restorative justice. It is also National Women and Girls HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, and often in our HIV decriminalization work, we are asked about, what about those who commit sexual harm? What about those with the intent to harm, especially in the name of violence prevention against women? These questions are often asked without input from survivors. The root causes of harm go unnoticed. Accountability, restoration, and transformation are out of reach for everyone once the criminal legal system is involved. We are left with more incarceration and carceral punishment, while many survivors' needs are not met. And as an abolitionist organization, we not only wanted to educate our partners and comrades about what abolition is, but also give you all alternatives to a system that continually stigmatizes and criminalizes our people. I hope this will be the first of many conversations we have as a movement where we can move past the carceral and move into justice and liberation. So given the topic that we are talking about today, I wanted to start with a grounding with one of our advocates, Jessica Piñaranda, and she will kind of just do some level setting and some grounding to help us make sure we are taking care of ourselves. Because this topic can be really heavy. And so we want to make sure that we are not leaving y'all with kind of like this jarring feeling when we have this. All right, Jessica, thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for creating the space, co-creating the space. Thank you to everyone that's introducing themselves in the comments. It's so nice to be here. My name is Jessica, use she, her pronouns. Before we get into more introductions, just want to kind of ground this together as we begin this conversation today. I'd like for us to maybe take a brief moment to settle into the space, maybe get whatever you might need to really be present and listen for yourself. And if it feels comfortable for everybody, maybe we start with just taking a nice steady breath in and a nice steady breath out. Our conversation today centers this idea that we are each other's harvest. And in abolition and in RJ and in transformative justice, that really at the core reminds us that the ways that we treat one another, tend to one another, especially when harm occurs, shape the future of our communities. That also means that people that are joining this conversation may carry many different experiences with harm, with accountability, with repair, and with justice. So as we begin this conversation today, I want you to be mindful of how things maybe are landing for you, where you might feel that in your body, and really think about how you can center care for yourself first and foremost, and know that you are not alone in this space. We are here together in this conversation for the next couple of minutes, and just really want to remind you all that we hold care for all those different experiences and stay open as much as we can to learning from one another collectively. And it feels good. You can close your eyes, maybe feel your feet on the ground. Just take one nice, deep, final breath in. Remind yourself you're here in community. You're here to listen. You're here to share, here to learn. And deep breath out. Maybe release your shoulders a little bit, unclench your jaw. And when you're ready, you can return to the space however you want to engage. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to you, Kitara.
Thank you, Jessica. Jessica joins us from the Reframe Health and Justice. And we're also joined by Amber Belangas. Oh, there she is. Amber is the ED of Restorative Action Alliance. And so before we get started with like this awesome panel and have our advocates ask some questions, Amber so graciously is going to give us a Restorative Justice 101 presentation to really ground us in this information of this framework.
Thank you so much, Kitara. I really am thrilled to be here in space with everyone, and I want to thank Jessica for such a wonderful grounding exercise as we are opening. All the folks in the chat, thank you for introducing yourselves and being here with us on this morning, afternoon, or wherever you are in the country. So when we were co-creating and looking at spending some time together for this webinar, we really wanted to take the opportunity to, create some shared language, some basic information about what does it mean when we talk about restorative justice and how it's utilized and all of those things. So what we're going to do now is sort of go through the basics, and that will help us really understand when we're using certain terms or we get further into our panel, give us sort of that same framework. So with that, we're going to jump into it. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the slides. I think, there we go. All right. So today, I just want to mention just real briefly about Restorative Action Alliance. So what we do at Restorative Action Alliance is we exist to end cycles of sexual violence. We are also an abolitionist organization, and we don't believe that ending sexual violence can include committing state violence against people in the process. And so that's the gist of what we do at Restorative Action Alliance. We include a lot of different people who are working and co-creating with us, and that's everyone from survivors to practitioners to people who have been impacted by the system and everything in between. So having said that, let's get into the meat and potatoes of restorative justice. So the first thing that we really want to think about is, what is restorative justice? And I see from the chat, people are coming from different perspectives, may have some, base level knowledge, but we're kind of going all the way back to the beginning. So restorative justice is a framework for responding to harm. So when we think about when we're in community with one another, we want to make sure that we are creating situations, systems, practices that allow us to respond to harm without defaulting to sort of carceral or punitive responses, because what we know is that when we hold humanity for all people, then we have better outcomes. So first and foremost, when we talk about restorative justice, it centers all of the people who are impacted by whatever harm has occurred, and it encourages meaningful accountability to repair that harm, so seeking to repair. And what a lot of people in advocacy want to hear about and how people are feeling in their community, in their body, is that they want community safety. And this means community safety for everyone. So it's important to know that at the core of restorative work is a belief in strong and respectful relationships. And that's sort of the underlying foundation of restorative practices. Harm is understood as a disruption in relationship rather than just a violation of rules or laws. And then the way to really work within that framework is that need for connection and understanding. The other thing I want to mention, because a lot of people think about restorative justice as a separate thing, but restorative justice is one component of a larger body of interdisciplinary study, and that is often referred to as restorative practices as a whole. So it is very important to start with an acknowledgement of where restorative practices came from. And the thing is that humans have been gathering together and connecting in different ways since the beginning of time. So our modern restorative practices that we know came from and echo ancient and indigenous practices that are developed by cultures all over the world. So what people are most familiar with are Native American, First Nation Canadian, but also comes from African, Asian, Celtic, Hebrew. Lots of different peoples have practiced restorative things in some shape or form. So, you know, when we look at how restorative practices have been modernized, there also are situations where they have been diluted or tried to be jammed into different systems. And we want to look at like keeping to the core principles of restorative practice. And that's that restorative practices help build healthy, empathetic communities. They increase our social capital between one another, decrease antisocial behavior, can be used to repair harm, and as we talked about before, really restore relationships. So sometimes it's really helpful to think about what restorative justice isn't, because there's a lot of co-opting, misinformation, thoughts, different spectrums. So often people will say, well, restorative justice is, you know, forced forgiveness. The person who has experienced harm is, you know, forced to forgive the person because they've participated in some process. That is not, forgiveness is not a prerequisite for restorative practices. It is not a slap on the wrist or ignoring serious harm that has occurred. It certainly does not eliminate consequences, because accountability is central, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. It is not passive punishment like carceral systems are. Something is not happening to someone. They are asked to be an active participant in a process that seeks to repair and address the needs of the person who has experienced harm. So it is not vengeance reframed. So for those who come from a system impact background, it is not, you know, forced vengeance or some need to have a pound of flesh, as some people say. It is holding humanity for everyone involved. And it's important to know that restorative justice is not always appropriate for every situation. Appropriate justice must be voluntary. It is a structured process. There's a lot of work that goes into bringing people together or doing different practices that are meant to repair harm. And there's a lot of careful preparation that happens. So it's really important when we talk about harm, and we alluded to this in the beginning, to talk about what do we mean by harm. And so I wanted to give us like a shared language around what is meant by harm. So harm is intentional or reckless actions that cause real physical, emotional, or relational injury. And then oftentimes people will refer to, their unmet needs, like the harm that occurred to me, unmet needs that are created by said injury. So we need to approach that with the understanding that people have different ideas of what is or isn't harm. For the purposes of this discussion and most restorative practices, this is a working restorative context sort of definition. And there are important clarifications to make. So we criminalize in our system a lot of things that don't meet that definition of harm, and really seek to weaponize people based on identity, class, socioeconomics, disability, all of those things. So just keeping in mind that sometimes the system criminalizes things. It's not something I need to tell this group that are just not harm. And also the fact that not all harm requires criminalization or is criminalized. So, we know that the system often creates more harms and perpetuates cycles. So it does not require criminalization in order to address it. And then also not all harm is criminalized by the broken system to begin with, because when you think about large sort of corporate things that harm many, many people, environmental, all of those things, some of those things are not even criminalized. So we need to just have the understanding that definitions of harm are shaped by culture, power, stigma, and misinformation, and that our abolitionist mindset asks us to really reimagine how we address harm and seek justice in ways that hold all people in humanity. And so that is really seeking to eliminate the use of surveillance, incarceration, community control, and other forms of state violence. So when we talk about the scope of practice, I mentioned earlier that a lot of people think about restorative justice in the context of what we call, or the system often calls, victim offender conferencing. That's where you bring someone together who has experienced harm, and then you bring the person who is the author of that harm together in conference with one another for purposes of understanding, repair, and working towards forward movement. But other types of practices include, that facilitated dialogue, community accountability circles, which also may include other stakeholders who were also affected. There's also vicarious restorative conferences. Our system often creates situations where there is not the opportunity for someone who caused harm and someone who experienced harm to be in the same room with one another because of legal ramifications. And so vicarious process will allow for someone to be brought into conference and community with someone who has committed a similar harm, so that they can build understanding, do a bit of role playing, utilize the facts of the harm that had occurred for the person who experienced harm, and it can have healing properties in that way. And then one of the things that we do at Restorative Action Alliance and a lot of other organizations and community groups use our peer support circles. And this is a community building model whereby you use restorative practices to create safe spaces. At Restorative Action Alliance, we group people together based on shared lived experience. So we have survivor circles, we have system impacted circles, we have combined circles. So it's just important to note that the scope of practice for restorative justice and restorative practices is wide and can be creative, but does have sort of certain components, and that not every situation calls for the same model. So in any conversation about restorative practices, it's important to note the difference between carceral approaches and restorative approaches. And that is that the criminal legal system is adversarial. It creates us and them sort of scenarios. It separates, it disconnects. It asks, who is to blame? What law is broken? How can we punish them? How do we close or dispose of this case? And how does one side win? And that creates situations that foster brokenness and disconnection, and doesn't, bring us back into community with one another. RJ really shifts that focus from rule breaking to relationship and repair. Restorative justice is relational and done in community. And so it asks the questions, what happened? Who was harmed? What needs were created as the result of that harm? Who is responsible for repair? That might be the person who caused harm, as well as people who may have been complicit, or systems that created the situation that led to harm, all of that. And then what will prevent recurrence? Because at the end of the day, what we're looking at is we want everyone to be whole. And how do we center humanity in all of these processes? And so, well, a lot of times, people will conflate the idea of accountability with punishment. So when we talk about accountability must be meaningful. And what does that mean? So having someone acknowledge the impact of their actions, listening without defensiveness, which is a skill that needs to be built, taking responsibility or ownership over actions and that they were harmful. It does demand truth telling, which brings up discomfort for all the people involved, but can be moved through and is critical to the process. And participating in repair. We talked about passive versus, just like punishment happening to you. Participating in some way. And maybe an example is if someone is experiencing trauma because of the harm that they occurred with them, and maybe they couldn't, something happened to them, violence happened to them on a subway, right? And so now, they haven't taken a subway in a year. And for building understanding, they would like the person who caused the harm to refrain from utilizing the subway and see how that impacts their life for a certain period of time. That may be something that, could be an agreement that would facilitate repair. And obviously changing behavior. Accountability is active responsibility. And so when we talk about listening to all survivor voices, it is really important to understand what carceral approaches deliver to survivors, and then also sort of what it is that survivors report that they need. So carceral approaches, as I mentioned, it provides a lot of disconnection. That's cross-examination, questioning of their experience, immediate denial and minimization for self-preservation for people in the system. Survivors report that they experience powerlessness to control the process. There's a lot of poor communication and a feeling of lack of voice. No space for that meaningful accountability, because if meaningful accountability occurs, punitive measures are increased. Knowledge without context. So we see that a lot with, someone knowing about a hearing, or conviction registries that deem somebody who has gone through repair as still dangerous. Again, that creates fear in community. Siphoning of resources from services and support in favor of punishment and control, which centers the author of the harm rather than the survivor. And so why do we say use restorative practices? Those harmed often simply want acknowledgement and answers that are not provided by carceral systems. Punishment does not necessarily prevent future harm. It often creates the exact conditions and brokenness and destabilization that caused harm to happen in the first place. Repair can strengthen safety, And survivors who participate in restorative processes often report higher satisfaction and greater sense of voice and autonomy, which is what they feel has been taken from them through the harm, to traditional court processes. So finally, as we sort of round up this very sort of down and dirty, like restorative practices and justice 101, we want to really address head on some of those questions. So when we're doing our advocacy work and we're participating in different things, opponents will often say, well, what about violent crimes and sexual assault? That restorative practices can't help that. And what about intentional HIV transmission? So it's important to understand that these questions reflect sort of a carceral logic, right? That lives inside of all of us to some extent because of cultural messaging, experiences, all of those things, and human nature. So these questions reflect a belief that punishment equals safety. So that is what we need to combat when these questions are asked. It also reflects stigma about certain populations, people with HIV, marginalized communities, processes themselves, and also assigns assumption about intent. And it also has a significant misunderstanding of public health practice. You know, this idea that, you know, someone who lives with HIV by virtue of just living with HIV somehow is a threat, or that they have been given all the tools that they need to manage their health and their interactions. So this deep reliance on carceral responses also a reflection of cultural messages about who it is that deserves safety. And so we want to move people into frameworks and education that they are not asking those types of questions. What they don't ask is what responses support people, repair harm, and improve health outcomes to break cycles of violence. So we want to drive them in that direction. And so at this time, I'm going to pass it back to our lovely host to go into the next part of our program.
Thank you so much, Amber. That was such a great presentation. Before we get to the Q&A, I do want to make one housekeeping note. You may have seen on the flyers and in the advertisements that Maryland advocate and EG of Older Women Living Life, Melanie Reese, would be joining us. Unfortunately, she is not feeling well, and so will not be able to be on this webinar. And so I will hope you join me in wishing her well wishes and a speedy recovery, and know that her presence will be missed and her experience as well. All right, so let's get to the fun part and like answer some questions. And as Amir put in the chat, if you have any thoughts or questions about restorative justice, stigma, criminalization, please put them in the chat and we will get to them after our moderated panel. All right. So one of the, I think, biggest questions that folks have, especially in the HIV decriminalization and justice movement, is how can we transform conversations around sex for people living with HIV or not living with HIV with the restorative justice framework? And how can it be used to combat stigma? Amber, you were talking a lot, so I'm gonna let Jessica answer this question first.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that great grounding in RJ and restorative practices, Amber. As I said again, my name is Jessica. I am a partner with Reframe Health and Justice. We are a queer, trans, BIPOC consulting collective that supports organizations and movements in deepening their practices of care and compassion and collaboration. And within that, part of what we do is really address some of the ways in which we are in a different relationship, right? With things like supporting people who are experiencing violence across the spectrum. We do a lot of sex worker health and harm reduction, for example, and HIV criminalization laws have been one of the many targets for this community in particular, right? And there is this larger conversation around our discomfort with our relationship to sex in general, and also our discomfort with interrogating our relationships and our responsibility to engaging in relationship that includes sometimes sex, right? And in thinking about that, instead of the way we address some of that discomfort is through punishment and shame, right? And so, you know, HIV has been framed through risk, through surveillance, through like active criminalization. And restorative practice and abolition and TJ ask us a different set of questions. I think the beautiful thing about this framework is that it actually asks us to slow down and question why we are engaging in a particular way, why we want to say yes to criminalize folks and kind of, you know, as some of our elders in lineage, you know, in RJ and TJ tell us, like, get the cops out of our heads, literally, you know, and doing that with a set of questions of what does care look like between people who are in consensual sexual relationships, right? What do people need to make informed choices about their own bodies? You know, it shifts this place of criminalization to like bodily autonomy and self-determination, instead of assuming that folks are engaging in harm and criminal intent, where we could create a space for honest dialogue about consent, right? About communication, about disclosure, right? Having entire conversations in the community. How do we want to hold disclosure and navigating that power, and lessen the stigma that thrives in that fear? Restorative justice and TJ processes can be created where we can have community dialogues, right, around speaking openly about sexuality. It doesn't have to be about harm. A great thing about these models is that it gives us tools to have conversations before harm even happens, right? And so we can have community dialogues around, you know, things that are happening in our hyperlocal communities, right? Including talking with young people, elders, intergenerational spaces where we're co-learning, peer learning around sexuality, health. Maybe we learn from the mistakes of our elders. We learn from the mistakes of, you know, one another, right? Without immediately being cast as, you know, less than, criminal, etc., right? That doesn't mean that the harm maybe doesn't disappear, right? But it means that we respond to harm through this like preventative repair. We build understanding, we strengthen community accountability that is shared, and centers dignity rather than this surveillance and punishment.
Thank you. Amber, how about you? What are how do we transform these conversations around sex?
So I appreciate so many, and want to plus one so many things that Jessica just shared. And I also want to really highlight the usefulness of restorative practices just as a way of living, right? Because when we are in relationship and connection and all of our systems create opportunity for that, then we have the skills that we need to repair harm when it occurs, to break down stigmas. We're connected rather than disconnected, and connection and proximity to all sorts of people. It breaks down those fears that people associate with, you know, sex being something that's not positive. The other thing that I really want to highlight is the way that we approach sex as part of being a human, right? And so Jessica mentioned young people. We, in our culture, we foster it as a secretive, dirty thing. Some people are not even comfortable with the idea of consensual sex, much less the idea of harm, which is, another layer. So this idea that just like we teach our children math, and we teach our children about reading and writing, humans are sexual beings. And it is important that we treat that as an important way that we move through the world and ask those questions. What do healthy relationships, but what do they look like? How do we do intentional things to make sure that people have the tools in order to have healthy relationships? And then finally, I think we really need to have open and honest conversations about where carceral and punitive impulses come from, right? Jessica mentioned learning from our elders, learning from people in community, and the more connection that we have, the less distrust and fear. And so that's my thoughts on how we break down some of it. We really need to be asking a different set of questions, approaching with curiosity, being in proximity, and utilizing. We always say like the magic is in the mechanics. So we create intentional spaces and mechanics so that foster these opportunities for connection and repair.
Thank you. You mentioned in your presentation, Amber, that using the restorative justice framework is seeking this alternative to the criminal legal system. And so I want to pose this question. What made you decide to seek alternatives to the criminal legal system when it failed to meet your needs?
So when I talk about my own personal situation, my sexual assault occurred while I was serving in the United States Marine Corps. And so working within an already hierarchical and frankly patriarchal system, it was already very difficult to navigate that system in and of itself. And honestly, I was blamed, shamed, disbelieved, all of those things. And I was told within that system that my disclosure, rather than the harm that occurred to me, would tear the unit apart, would do all of these things. The process would be lengthy. It would destroy morale, all of those different things that you hear in different situations that are the experiences of survivors. And so I didn't choose the criminal legal system because in my experience, I didn't feel that it was available to me. I work with all sorts of survivors, and sometimes, people do pursue that only to realize later that they feel more harm has occurred to them through the system. But years later, what I learned through my work, my life experience, all of those things, is that a different process could be available to me. And the most healing thing that I ever experienced was what I mentioned is a vicarious restorative process. Because my healing and my realizations and all of the things took time, which is not uncommon, to work through and come to a place where I wanted to work on repair and find healing. The person who harmed me was not available and not willing. So sometimes when people are not willing to participate in a process, you cannot force people into processes. They will not be useful. It has to be completely voluntary. So I participated in a vicarious situation where I have sat with someone who committed similar type of harm, asked them questions, and they told me, what kind of mind frame they were in. So I found this so healing, much more than any other sort of process would have been, because for me, it helped me work through things not being my fault, right? And that acknowledgement, that repair, understanding that, sometimes harm is not about you. So that's what I found most useful about my experience. And on the regular, I sit in community and facilitate community circles with people who have caused harm, and I learn and grow in every experience. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Jessica, what made you decide to seek alternatives and to the criminal legal justice system and brought you to restorative justice?
That is still a really hard question for me to answer as someone that has survived not just interpersonal violence, but state-sponsored violence, and as a survivor and a person that has supported many survivors, in particular criminalized survivors. It's important for me to name that due to the structural racism, structural oppression that exists in the country that we live in, and even globally, right, towards people of the global South, the systems that have been created, as Amber mentioned, right, to respond to the harm, to in many ways try to lure us into punishment as a way to heal, right? As a young person that experienced various forms of abuse and harm, I did not see myself seen. I saw community members of mine, family members of mine that were caught up in the criminal legal system, right? And so why would I trust a system that was also actively, harming my own community? It was not a system that I thought would actually respond to my needs. And at the core of abolition, at the core of transformative justice, is really anchoring in what are the unmet needs, right, of that person. What did I need as a survivor? What did my community need? What did my family need? What did it mean to be able to even be in a relationship to ask for needs, right? As an immigrant, as a young immigrant coming to this country, still learning to navigate and be in this process of forced assimilation. So I did not seek that system because I didn't think that the system actually was, and in fact, it has never been meant for folks that look like me. And that is important, especially when I think about the communities that we support through our community care work, right? We see a lot of trans, Black, Indigenous, and other, trans women of color that are deeply impacted by criminalization, where the system is not even as co-option of RJ is happening within the criminal legal system, they're not even seen as worthy of being able to engage in restorative practices, right? They're not seen as the right, perfect survivor that has access to an alternatives to heal, right? Even if we know that the system is not going to provide folks that approach for healing, like it's not even accessible to them because they're not deemed worthy, right? They're not deemed worthwhile. And so the system is created and designed and acting in its as it's meant to be. And my fear now in coming into doing more community care work, where restorative practices and the ethos of abolition really mark the work that I do, is the co-option, right? Is the diluting to what Amber was saying, and the using these practices, right? Again, that come from community by the state, and the state turning it on us and saying, well, see, we gave you what you all have wanted and it still didn't work. When in fact, the conditions have not changed. Transformative justice and abolition requires for the conditions and the systems to change. We know the system is the main abuser and the main harm that that is forcing, punishment and harm against our communities. And so fast forward, I came to this because I didn't have a space to heal. I wanted to support, in really traditional ways, I thought, survivors, and noticed that even in the nonprofit industrial complex, the access to those services were boundaried, were limited, were paternalistic, were really seeped in carceral feminism, particularly for folks across the gender spectrum, and really having us reconsider that we still needed to fit within a system that wanted to tell us how to be safe, that didn't ask us, what does safety look like for you? Who in your community can support your safety? It was very rigid, and forced many survivors to not have self-determination and autonomy over their bodies in these frameworks. And so the place that I'm at now as a practitioner is really wanting to support people in skilling up and being in a practice of daily practice, right, in our conversations, and building those relational skills and getting to know, our community members in some real ways, and really shifting outside of what the systems will never be able to provide us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned seeking these alternatives, this place of healing, and given our audience, how do you see these alternatives from the criminal punitive systems and restorative justice work and HIV justice, the HIV justice movement? Let me repeat that. I am so sorry. How do you see restorative justice work and the HIV justice movement? How do you see that playing out, and how our advocates who are watching this, how can they start applying some of these frameworks in their work?
I'm not sure who you wanted to address to.
Yeah, whoever would like to go first.
Okay, so I think it's really important, and we have talked about this already a little bit, but again, to create ways to live restorative in general, right? And so it is approaching most things with curiosity and humanity, right? And so when you're talking about advocacy work, it is really important when you're in different spaces to interrogate initial reactions when you're experiencing discomfort. And everybody has different lived experiences. Some people see the criminal legal system as safety because of what they grew up believing in the community that they come from. Some people absolutely cannot see the criminal legal system as anything but harm, because it is. So when we're talking about advocacy, sometimes I find that people don't have conversations, which is actively not restorative, it's disconnection versus connection, because of fear and because it isn't safe for them to do so. So both of those things can coexist. But interrogating assumptions is one of the best ways in advocacy to be in proximity and community with people, so that we can change understanding and reimagine what justice looks like. So that is one of my initial reactions and what comes up for me when you ask that question.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what you said, Amber, and I'd also I'd add to, as a movement, right, to think about who are we responsible to, and in making as we're advocating for things to change, in what ways are we also centering and emphasizing changes to the material conditions that are continuing to impact those that are living with HIV, the ways in which stigma is being used as a weapon to continue to criminalize our folks, right? And as a movement, when we're making concessions, when we are thinking about what we're going to be advocating for, thinking about who is most impacted, and are those advocates at the table, right? Are those that are most directly impacted actually shaping those advocacy asks, those where they're not just a story, where they're not just, you know, there to share their story, where we're practicing meaningful community building, where we are having this dialogue, and also, you know, to I really want to emphasize again, like having a conversation as a movement around the ways in which we are engaging in carceral logic as well, through our policy building, through our movement building. In what ways are we not tending to our organizing communities, right? Who are you unable to have conversations about accountability or repair, or you may be in conflict with a fellow policy, you know, organization, or a fellow policy organizer, or people in community? Often our movements are ruptured because we are unable to be able to tend to ourselves as organizers, while the system continues to keep their foot on our necks. We are in inter-movement, you know, conflict that really this allows us to be in relationship, as Amber said. And so I would start there. I would start with strengthening our relationship as a movement, getting really, really good with being in conflict, in generative conflict with one another, bringing the folks to the front that are most directly impacted in a meaningful way, where we pay folks, where we're advocating for the material conditions to meaningfully change. We're not just having a platform for the sake of having a platform, where we're investing, you know, financially in education and dialogue. What would it be like if, you know, policy advocacy movements included community dialogues instead of just lobby days, instead of just going to the Hill, right? Like, what if we were creative? What if we use these restorative practices in our movements to start to get skilled up and start to get better in that, in many ways, right? Who are we leaving behind? What about our incarcerated folks inside as well? Who is often doing the labor in our movements? So there's so many things I'd say that we can start with. We got to take care of our home first in many ways, so that can be tight, and in itself really a place where our movements can thrive, so that we can continue to take on this larger movement. And I'd say, you know, some of the more common things, right? Like, how do we get more funding right now, or how do we get creative around the threat to funding for people needing healthcare, right? Harm reduction is on the chopping block. Harm reduction, we can't even say it, right? So, you know, in what ways are we unapologetic about getting our people the needs that they have? Housing, you know, basic income, you know, additional ways for folks to think about what are their safety needs in some concrete material way, like mutual aid. Does a movement have a role in thinking about larger mutual aid efforts outside of just, you know, changing laws across the country? Maybe I'll stop there before I get a little bit too excited.
No, we love the excitement. This is what it's all about, right? Inciting this like curiosity for something different, something better, right? I'm gonna ask us our last questions, and then we're gonna answer some questions from the audience. How can restorative justice approaches meet this moment of escalating criminalization and violence? What lessons can restorative justice teach us in this political climate? And Amber, I'm gonna let you go first.
Okay, so those are some big questions, and you know, we can talk about what comes up from us, but I think one of the things to just really think about and feel in our bodies is that we don't always have to have all the answers. we have to work together to reimagine something new. And so one of the things in our political climate that people are very uncomfortable with is that this idea that we bring things to the forefront very quickly because we think it might work. We put it into law, right? And it harms exponential amounts of people. And that is a hasty sort of way that things happen. But in order to change those, we have to have all the answers, all the research, all the things. So when we invest in community conversations, in dialogue, in restorative practices, to change the mindset, to bring that curiosity into the way that we interact with each other, in the media, in politics, in all of the things, then that will change the way that we address harm and seek justice. Now, that sounds like really big and theoretical, but you see it sort of, to Jessica's point, you see it sort of in smaller aspects where people are using art as advocacy to foster connection, community conversations, participating to bring people in power into community with people who are most deeply impacted. Demanding that not only do we need to come to you as a legislator, you need to come to us in our community to have conversations. So those are some of the things in the political climate. And I think that more and more we are seeing a general exhaustion amongst people on what we're doing now, right? The political climate is very fraught, people are exhausted, it's very chaotic. So bringing these practices to the forefront is actually being received in a way that people love the concept, but to Jessica's point, how do we get from there to intentional investment in it, right? We can say we love restorative practices, but if we don't fund it, we don't participate, and we don't do all of those things, we can't move it forward. And then finally, I want to address sort of an elephant. I don't want to call it an elephant because it is not lost on anyone that there is a significant discussion around power, privilege, patriarchy, Jeffrey Epstein, all of those things, and sexual harm. So in this political climate, it is imperative for us, as Jessica mentioned, to take care of our own sort of bodies, take care of our movement, be in community with, be in lockstep, have shared messaging, be able to address things head on, because it is difficult and it is fraught. But what all of these things tell us is that what questions should we be asking? We should be asking why, when individuals amass power and privilege, is it sexual harm that they use to amass more? So those are some of my thoughts on the political climate and some of the things that we can do. But at bare minimum, we need to be changing hearts and minds out of this carceral mindset to approach with the curiosity to imagine something different together rather than disconnected.
Jessica, you're going to take us home.
Well, I will try. I think first I want to say that in this current moment, we have been through so many of these current moments, and the ask is for us to disconnect, right? And I'd say the ways in which RJ, Abolition, actually calls us to be in right now is to like stay embodied, like stay as present as possible. And if you can't, then seek support. Think about ways in which other people can support you in staying connected. And that doesn't mean, you know, maybe there's a moment where we all need a break, we all need to disconnect, we all, for sure. But if there's lessons that we are already learning from the ways in which community is showing up for one another, I think that that is where we need to continue, right? The lessons that we're seeing coming out of Minneapolis, the lessons that we're seeing coming out from hyperlocal communities, doing mutual aid efforts, ICE defense teams, looking out for their neighbors, you know, creating childcare collectives. Like, this moment is asking us to actually get deeper into relationship versus away from relationships, right? There's a lot of conversation around how isolating, you know, the political climate is. And that is when we ask, as relationship being the core of these practices, to be and remain in relationships, and be in that mess of being in relational building with one another, in our movements, in your organization, with your families, with the people that you care about. This political climate is asking us to stay embodied, to stay in relationship, and to recognize that care is how we stay in the struggle. Thank you, y'all.
Wow, what a wonderful way to end our panel. Yeah, I think, you know, our strategic plan slogan, advancing justice rooted in liberation, I think that is part of the core of our work as Abolition. Is roots are a system that help nourish plants, that nourish something. And what better way to like build strong foundations for us to grow and advance justice is to work together to nourish each other. So now we're going to get some wonderful questions from our audience. And so we have a question from Jasmine. Earlier, Amber said that restorative practices are not always appropriate. Is this because of certain circumstances, such as a criteria that determines if RJ should be used, or a process of using RJ first and changing to a different approach as needed?
So thank you, Jasmine, for that question. And so what we mean by that is there are certain core things that need to be present in order to participate in a process. So I'm a person that believes that restorative practices are a spectrum. There is always room for some restorative measure in somewhere. I'm in favor of using practices wherever they can be used within whatever confines. However, when you're talking about a restorative justice process where you're bringing people together, it must be voluntary, right? It must hold humanity for all people. So a lot of times what we see with the system is people say to someone, well, if you don't want to go to jail, then participate in this restorative justice process. And so that's not super voluntary, and it's not going to be effective. And a lot of work has to be done before you're ever going to bring, you know, those folks together, because then you are in a situation where you're causing more harm than if you had not done that. So there are a lot of different things that might cause some component of restorative practice or a process to not be appropriate. And accountability is necessary. So if someone is still in a place where they are rationalizing, minimizing all of those things, it is not the time. That doesn't mean that it's never the time, because people learn, grow, and change, and that's what we know about humanity. It means that there's a lot more work to be done before a restorative process is appropriate. So the restorative practice that applies there is that the person who is the author of harm may engage in work with a restorative practitioner or different processes outside of working with the person who they harmed for some time before they are able to ever connect in a direct process. So hopefully that helps answer some of the question.
No, that's great. I think people don't realize that the criminal legal system is very coercive, and so and in that way, I think it is in that way like harmful to everyone involved when we are forced to like make decisions that often become out of our control. Our next question comes from Shakina. And this kind of gets to like how punitive a system can be and how often like the harm we see in our communities are often imitations or acting out the harm we see from these systems. Shakina asks, if a federal law violates a person incarcerated, an incarcerated trans person who no longer has access to appropriate clothing, needs, etc., can restorative justice be provided to heal? And I'll let whoever would like to answer that question.
I think I'm understanding the combination. I'd say that generally, as a practitioner, we have to also be. There are circumstances, as Amber has said, where restorative practice or process can never happen, right? Because we're looking at the power dynamic. The state would not be a participant that is an equal player due to the power dynamic, right? So that is unequal. They have much more power to engage in some sort of restorative practice. So I'd say if the state is in violation, especially someone that is incarcerated by the prison industrial complex, then no, restorative justice cannot provide the healing when they are causing the harm in such a manner that we don't have, the tools to engage meaningfully in I would say even in a consensual way with the state. I'd say at that point we'd have to think about other ways for accountability, that could be civil legal remedies, different things like that. I'm not a lawyer specifically, but Amber, maybe you think differently, but I think the state has way too much power to be able to think about being the person that's going to provide healing, especially the prison industrial complex. The healing part would be to abolish the prison industrial complex, and then engage in actions towards that that can be under a larger umbrella of abolition. Is my response to that question.
I just want to add on, because that is exactly sort of when there is such a different power dynamic. One of the sort of central tenets of bringing people together, and again, it's a little different when you're talking about systems and people, because you're not talking about one relationship, right? Is that everyone has equal value when you're bringing people together. So the state as an entity, or the powerful players, even if it's powerful players within the state, would need to acknowledge that everybody in the process had equal value, and that's not what we see from the system. And so that would make it inappropriate. What I have seen in practice is situations in smaller community where an institution and their leadership engage in a process by which they acknowledge harm and they create systems for repair. So for instance, within like a religious institution or within a academic setting where someone was significantly harmed, leadership was brought into community to engage in some restorative practices, and a reparative agreement arrived where there was education that the institution invested in and invited the person to participate in or not participate in. So there are, again, things are a spectrum. And it's an art, and it takes a lot of growing, learning, and imagination to engage in these practices that we all can put in our toolbox.
Thank you, Amber. Since we're about 3 minutes before we wrap up, I think our last question will be from Carissa. As someone who's used and benefited from a restorative process after a sexual assault, I absolutely see the value in changing our system to a restorative justice focused framework rather than a carceral one. However, I still struggle thinking of a solution to the rare circumstances of repeated and or severely violent people who pose a danger to the people around them. What does it look like for a restorative justice focused system to address those situations?
So I think this is a question that arrives a lot for many survivors, because at the end of the day, when a survivor thinks about their experience, what they're looking for is safety, and also safety, community, and knowing that it won't happen to someone else, right? And so that speaks specifically to the question that is asked. And so a restorative approach looks like providing actual services, reentry, because what causes cycles of violence to reoccur is brokenness, destabilization, rationalization that harm is okay, because that is, people get to a place of such destabilization with our current approaches that they're like, well, even if I hold up my end of the bargain, the social contract, I am isolated, shamed, all of those things. And so the restorative approach to that is to hold humanity from everyone, for everyone, while also creating safety. So we have to reimagine what that looks like. And right now we're not doing that at all. We're not providing services in reentry. We're not having real conversations about people who are at risk of causing additional harm. We're shaming, blaming, isolating, and harming. And we are often doing that. The chronic harm of the system causes people to act in their trauma, to reenact what feels safe to them. And sometimes safety, even though we may not be able to understand it, is harm to someone. And so we need to address those deep issues.
All right. We are at the end of our webinar. We've had some questions about resources. So Jessica, Amber, if you can maybe put in the chat, like where people can find you, what are some resources to get into restorative justice, that would be awesome. Okay. And before we leave, I just want to plug CHLP's strategic plan, which is a roadmap to our future where people living with HIV and other stigmatized conditions live free from stigma, violence, and criminalization. Again, I want to thank Amber and Jessica for joining me this Tuesday afternoon/morning for this really important and wonderful conversation. I learned a lot as someone who's been around a lot of folks who are in abolition and restorative justice. And I hope our audience learned a lot as well. And please know that this is the first of many conversations. And we hope that you go back to your communities, your organizations, your movements with a new way of thinking that addresses harm in a holistic and transformative way. Yeah. So with that, we're gonna end our webinar.